Welcome to lesson 4 of our cultural diversity training. This lesson is about racism and white privilege. My name is Desiree Cochran-Norfolk. In this lesson, we're going to explore the historical foundations of race and racism, the cost of racism for both people of color and white people, the concept of white privilege, psychological responses to racism, and strategies for eradicating racism. We're also going to focus on how counselors can take action at the individual, community, and systemic levels. And then finally, we're going to close with a reflective activity, kind of envisioning a model of a non-racist community and counseling services within that. Race is often simplified and masked by everyday social tasks and perceived physical and human differences. Race can appear to be innate and concrete rather than an ascribed human characteristic that's used to categorize human beings into subgroups. Racial differences are largely a result of genetic drift or isolation, the interaction between geography and biology, like the production of melanin as a biological adaptation with lighter skin tones in latitudes that receive less sunlight, or the development of sickle cell disease as an adaptive response to living in malaria-prone regions. These physical distinctions among individuals have served as a method for classifying them and mistakenly assigning complex traits like musical ability or intelligence or athleticism to a few biological markers. And these racial classifications were so ingrained in our psyche that we believe physical differences are a natural justification and evidence that racial differences exist. Although it is confused with the term ethnicity, race implies a common descent of heredity, while ethnicity is referring to cultural characteristics. And these concepts often overlap and are used synonymously in discussions of culture. And also, individuals group various ethnicities into the same racial category, even though an ethnicity can contain several races. So in the United States, racial categories are not biologically based, but they represent social constructs that are used for collecting data on race and ethnicity. So the Office of Management and Budget of the United States said that the development of these standards stemmed in large measure from new responsibilities to enforce civil rights laws. So data was needed to monitor equal access in housing and education and employment and other areas for the populations that historically had experienced discrimination and differential treatment because of their race or their ethnicity. So the idea of lineage started in the Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French folklore. And it was really used in conjunction with breeding lines or like the stock of animals. But then it started being used in identifying new populations that were discovered in travels in the 16th century. And then race was divided into 4 geographic regions. So we had the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then later on, it was further labeled by individualistic characteristics, depending on the predominant fluid, like the blood, the phlegm, the color, and the person's melancholy. So humans from the 4 regions were then further described by their disposition. And then people from America were described as obstinate, happy, and free. People from Europe were described as white, optimistic, muscular, active, and intelligent. People from Asia were described as melancholy, stiff, and severe. People from Africa were described as black, slow, foolish, and negligent. Then in 1777, Johann Blumenbach expanded the classification system, and he coined the term Caucasian to describe white European as ideal beauty based on his belief that humans originated from the Caucasus Mountains in Russia, and they were created from God's vision. So he labeled other racial groups as well. And then early racial categorizations were quite Eurocentric, and they kind of hinted at a rank order of races with whites or Europeans at the top, then Asians and Americans in the middle, and Africans at the bottom. So racism is just an ongoing, multi-dimensional, dynamic process that's inherent to the development and maintenance of an institutionalized, hierarchical, racial classification system. It's going to operate simultaneously on individual, group, and system levels, and it's going to involve intentional and also unintentional negative or erroneous or stereotypical beliefs about race and the consequences of actions like interpersonal behavior or public policy decisions. A racial worldview is really just a defining cultural characteristic in that individuals and groups perceive and understand each other through this kind of socially constructed prism that's going to be transmitted to succeeding generations. So it's just going to be passed down and passed down. Jones in 1997 identified 3 levels of racism. We have individual, institutional, and cultural. And these levels intersect and they're going to influence one another, and they may be covert or overt, unintentional or intentional. Individual racism is going to refer to personal attitudes and beliefs in white superiority and the inferiority of people of color, with the physical differences among people used as an explanation of either social, moral, or intellectual behavior. It's going to involve adverse behavior of one individual or a small group of people. So some examples of this might be like racial slurs or stereotyping. Then institutional racism is characterized as like customs and practices within social systems that lead to racial inequalities. So an example might be disproportionate numbers of racial minorities that are underemployed, undereducated, incarcerated, or under-resourced. Cultural racism is going to refer to the belief that cultural values and practices of white European descent individuals are superior to those of other racial groups. And those values may be evident in things like art, economics, religion, and language. A few examples of institutional and cultural forms of racism throughout the U.S. are the Naturalization Law in 1790, Manifest Destiny in the 1800s, Jim Crow laws, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Dawes Act in 1887. Then we had like the Indian Removal Act, People v. Hall, the boarding school movement, the Indian Appropriation Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Eugenics movement, the Indian Reorganization Act, California Proposition 227. These levels of racism have really severe negative cognitive, affective, and interpersonal and physical costs for people of color. So to understand racism today, we need to look at its roots. Race was socially constructed to categorize and rank people based on physical traits. But the deeper function was about power and control. So U.S. history contains a lot of examples here. So the Indian Removal Act in 1830 forced Native peoples off their ancestral lands. In People v. Hall in 1854, they declared Chinese people could not testify against whites in court. The boarding school movement in the 1870s sought to erase Native culture. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was the first law banning immigration based on nationality. The eugenics movement in 1883 justified sterilization and restrictive marriage laws. Then we had the 1980s crack versus cocaine sentencing disparities, which punished Black communities disproportionately compared to white cocaine users. And we know that chemically crack cocaine and powder cocaine are the same. But there was an 11-to-1 sentencing disparity. And we know that minority communities like African Americans predominantly used crack cocaine, and upper echelon rich white people basically were using powder cocaine. And so if you were caught with powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, it was an 11-to-1 sentencing disparity. So you would be punished 11 times more for possessing crack cocaine, and that disproportionately affected the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, predominantly African Americans. And those are only a few examples of individual, institutional, and cultural racism at work here. So for counselors, recognizing this history is going to help us understand clients' mistrust of systems and the intergenerational trauma that those are going to carry. Racism inflicts real, measurable harm across multiple domains. There's cognitive costs. Internalized racism is going to lead to self-doubt. It's going to diminish people's self-worth and leave them with feelings of inferiority. There's also affective costs like chronic stress, anger, grief, and shame, and all of that becomes embedded in emotional patterns. Then we have interpersonal costs. So we have strained relationships, mistrust, disrupted community cohesion. And the physical costs, we have like higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, maternal mortality rates, and a lot of other stress-related illnesses. So for clients, these costs are often going to show up in counseling as anxiety, depression, trauma symptoms, and also in relational struggles. And so as counselors, we have to validate that those challenges are not just personal problems, they're rooted in systemic inequities. And while people of color are going to bear the brunt of the racism, white people also pay costs. So we have the cognitive costs of distorted beliefs about superiority and also inferiority. And some deny the systemic inequities. Then we have the affective costs. So that's the guilt, the shame, the fear of engaging authentically across the racial lines. Then we have the interpersonal costs, which are limited relationships with people of color and reliance on stereotypes. And so those costs are often invisible, but really profound. Racism is going to diminish everyone's humanity by cutting off authentic connection and fostering fear. So as counselors, we help white clients confront those costs as part of their growth. And white privilege refers to unearned advantages and benefits automatically afforded to white people in societies that are structured by racial hierarchy. Privilege often feels invisible to those who have it because it's so normalized. And it comes with psychological and intellectual costs for white people, like the distorted worldview or the guilt or the denial. And there's a couple of common myths, like, for example, the belief that privilege doesn't exist or that mediocrity alone determines outcomes. And that's going to perpetuate that system. Importantly, privilege operates on a spectrum. People who are not white can still hold relative privilege based on skin tone, class, and other identities. So in counseling, failing to acknowledge white privilege risks reinforcing oppressive dynamics. When confronted with racism, white people may display varied psychological responses. So denial or colorblind racial attitudes, which ignore the systemic inequities. We have the myth of mediocrity, believing that hard work alone explains all the outcomes. Projection or focus on expectations, like highlighting reverse discrimination or good minorities. Janet Helms was a psychologist, and she identified some psychological dispositions of white racism, and that ranges from impulsive racism to principled activism. So effective impulsive disposition is an immediate emotional reaction rooted in bias, and a rational disposition is justifying inequities logically. A liberal disposition is acknowledging inequity but avoiding deep engagement. And a principled disposition is an intellectual awareness but very limited action. And a principled activistic disposition is fully engaged in dismantling racism. So as counselors, we may encounter clients at any of those stages. And our role is to meet them where they are and foster deeper self-awareness and accountability. So to eradicate racism, we have to start with ourselves. We need to confront that cultural tunnel vision or ethnocentrism, assuming that our worldview is universal. We need to avoid victim blaming, attributing problems to the client's cultures rather than the systemic barriers. We need to recognize the limits of consciousness raising, because awareness alone isn't going to equal change. And we need to guard against race-based stereotyping, so seeing people only as representatives of a group. So developing racial self-awareness is going to require some ongoing reflection, humility, and also supervision. because without this work, counselors just risk replicating the very inequities that they are called to address. In practice, counselors can address racism in sessions by asserting or assessing the racial identity, exploring any race-related stress, and also processing how trauma intersects with the other forms of oppression. We can support clients' school and community context by helping them access resources or assess levels of racism in their own environments and mobilize some allies for them. We can facilitate some race-related growth, helping the clients move from guilt or anger towards resilience, pride, and empowerment. This work acknowledges that healing isn't just individual, it's also relational and communal. And we have to advocate, as a counselor, we have to advocate for systemic change. So we need to look at political and legal concerns, like from Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Systemic advocacy has advanced equity, but disparities do persist, and that's going to require ongoing engagement in education and healthcare and justice reform. We also need to look at some economic concerns. So addressing like wage gaps or discriminatory lending or unequal employment practices. We also need to look at public health concerns and help fight disparities in access to care or disparities in outcomes and treatment. Counselors, we are uniquely positioned to connect people the different stories to the systemic advocacy. And whether that's lobbying for equitable school funding or joining community coalitions or our professional whatever, our role is going to be changing the conditions that are harming our clients. So let's close with a reflective activity. I want you to imagine what a non-racist community would look like. So as part of this, I want you to reflect on a couple of questions. What would a non-racist counseling service in school or communities look like? What school and community services would be available if it was non-racist? And what existing services would need to be adapted? What's one step that you could personally take toward building this community? I want you to take the time to write your responses. These questions are really just designed to move us beyond awareness into really envisioning some concrete change. Remember, eradicating racism requires both personal and systemic transformation, and counselors are at the intersection of both.